A very warm welcome from us. Welcome to Transformation Through Fashion Education Towards Systemic Change. It's great to see so many of you this evening. My name is Renata Staus, and together with my colleagues Franziska Schreiber and Valeska Schmidt-Thomsen, we are the co-organizers of Fashioning Education.
Today is the second public action of Fashioning Education, which is a collaborative research initiative to open, facilitate and formalize the debate on fashion education against the backdrop of global transformations. We're very much looking into the different fashion educational cultures for transformation. The 3-year project aims to share and interact by a series of annual public events, culminating in a closing conference next year, 2023. It is hosted by the Fashion Institute of the Berlin University of the Arts and funded friendly by the Einstein Foundation. Fashioning Education is currently shaped by 14 members from different countries and educational backgrounds. And in this sense, just let us know now through the chat, where are you joining from tonight?
The first public event of Fashioning Education, we asked, is it the end of fashion education towards new beginnings? And we concluded then that we see a chance in this end because everything starts with an end. So today we want to explore the question of the possibility of transformation through fashion education. Can fashion education affect systemic change? The modernist logic of the global West, fashion was constructed as the favorite child of capitalism, and fashion was really defined as essentially transient, modern, urban, thus Western. Fashion education has fed a system based on this narrative, ever faster and ever more. One of the fastest growing educational sectors. To contribute to regenerative formation, fashion education has to become unfashionable. It has to disrupt itself, to reconfigure itself, to be disruptive. This year's Transformation Through Fashion Education Towards Systemic Change.
Fashion Education continues to explore the transformative potentials of different fashion educational settings. We have invited 3 social fashion educational projects, and we have asked opposing positions to a long table discussion, supplemented by showcases of social fashion educational projects dedicated to new ecologies of community based on principles of collectivity, collaboration and care, proposing transformative tactics.
Within and beyond tertiary education, their inspiring projects, works, collaborations with a more social, more human, more collective approach to learning fashion. These are the 3 speakers who will introduce specific projects before we instigate a long table discussion. They are Stephanie Barker-Frey, who's joining us from London today, on Rigo, Lesiba Mabitsela from Johannesburg, on the Cutting Room Project, and Laya Chiraburu, who's joining us from Germany, Leipzig today, but who's come to Germany from India. And this brings us to our first speaker, and I briefly introduce Stephanie Barker-Frey. It's a great pleasure that you can join us, Stephanie, especially as it's the evening of the live launch of Rigo, which means that you will join us for a little while and then move over to this launch. Stephanie is the knowledge exchange lead for the School of Media and Communication at London College of Fashion, and she's also a member of the Global Advisory Board for the Council for International African Fashion Education. Her research interests center on fashion communication as community building practice in both local and global contexts by situating knowledge exchange at the core as means to generate transformational change. A warm welcome to you, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's brilliant to be here. Just before we start this quick 10-minute presentation of this project Rigo, I'd love to show you, there's 2 films to be showcased throughout here. So just to give you a flavour of what's to come, this is an excerpt from Rigo, the pilot version, which was known as Cut from 2020. And so it'd be great to show the cases first. Thank you.
Through this project, we are tackling the issue of knife crime. We're actually taking knives out of the streets and we are turning them into buttons and rivets to make a bespoke collection of jeans. And at the end, we will also organize a charity auction in order to sell the jeans. And with the funding raised, we will support a social enterprise with ongoing activities to fund further opportunities for young people in the fashion industry.
We brought together a small group of young people who had all been impacted by knife crime in various different ways. Their role really was to come together to work with the creatives in this project.
Very often in the news, we talk about negativity. I really believe in taking that negativity, creating awareness, turning into positive action.
It can inspire people to change their perceptions on how they view the world and how they view young people.
I think that nurturing children and young people is the single most important role of any society.
So, hello everyone, it's fantastic to be here again. My name's Stephanie Barker-Fry. I am the Knowledge Exchange Lead for the School of Media and Communication, but really Project REGO is very much the project of Dr. Francesco Mazzarella, who is not here for the very reason we said earlier. He's actually at the launch and probably incredibly busy with a million things going on at the moment. So I'm sort of representing him, but I was actually involved in the initial stages. So REGO means quite simply to rethink your ego, go again and again, and a continuous process of change in both yourself and in society. But just to give a bit of contextualization about where this project came from. So as you can see here, it's quite detailed and it's incredibly complex. This is an example of a sort of systems mapping process developed from research around the issue of knife crime. And that's a very real issue for young people in London, but actually not exclusive to London at all. It's a real global issue. And research has indicated to us so far that in order to really sort of tackle systemic change and try to make change happen, we have to adopt very much a public health approach to this. And that really means that to disrupt some of these factors and complexities highlighted here, that needs a multi-agency sort of attitude through collaboration. So working directly with the communities that are impacted at every stage of the process. So as part of our commitment as London College of Fashion and Centre for Sustainable Fashion, all the stakeholders involved, to our move next year to East London in Stratford, we have a real responsibility to work with young people in our local communities, our local schools, and through the sort of facilitation of platforms like Catalyst and Communities, which you saw on that video. So before REGO, which is launching tonight, and a little bit more on that later, the pilot version was called CUT, and this is where I was involved with students from the School of Media and Communication. So CUT launched in 2020 in a really sort of a very intense year in terms of the pandemic, in terms of incredible sort of activist movements that were taking place at the time. And the idea was to bring together stakeholders from Waltham Forest Council, which is also where I happen to live, students from the Year 1 PR and Branding course at London College of Fashion, Black Horse Lane Atelier, which are a denim manufacturer and company retailer operating in Walthamstow, and Catalyst and Communities, and they are a youth social initiative that work with young people in the area who have been impacted by knife crime in some capacity. So essentially this was to create what you would call, I guess, a social enterprise. So through all the knives that they collated in the borough through an initiative called Knife Safe, 270 knives were used to create the rivets and buttons and zippers in 150 pairs of jeans. So we wanted to raise money, but also raise awareness around knife crime. I think more importantly, give young people in the area skills, apprenticeships, training to facilitate and familiarise themselves with fashion as a potential enterprise or future career opportunity. So that was taking place, and Francesca was obviously leading on that. We were having some discussions, and then at the same time, I was looking at some research, which very much correlated to my discipline, and at the time I was teaching on the Fashion PR and Communication course. And this was about adopting new approaches to public relations. And that was because, so much was happening socially and culturally that we felt that this sort of archaic idea as a PR, as a gatekeeper, really needed to change. And we wanted to look at the PR as a way of building bridges between brands and communities, facilitating conversations with outreach champions, perhaps underrepresented people, and actively seek out voices for the next generation. So to do that, we really needed to bring in the voices of our students, but also with the local communities. And that's how we worked on a knowledge exchange model. So knowledge exchange is a way that it's quite common ground in the UK, how we work with third parties, whether that's public, private, NGOs, charities, individuals, co-creating insights between that party and our students to generate more positive outcomes that will go back into our communities or our local environment. So in this instance, we decided that we would transform a 10-week curriculum so that students coming straight into university, looking at these disciplines, would look at them from a really sort of transformative impact and look at PR and branding as a tool for igniting social change within the fashion industry and beyond. So we got them to respond to a live brief set by Francesco to create communication campaigns for the launch. And so this was the initial question that they researched and responded to. How can Generation Z harness the strength of authentic PR strategies in order to shift common perceptions of socio-cultural issues through the lens of fashion activism? And actually this was done through some, for us, particularly radical pedagogic styles. We brought in a whole new roster of guest speakers, workshops. Obviously this was all done online in the pandemic. And we really got to grips with the nuances and factors driving very specific niche areas in London. I mean, not so much for me, but certainly for some of our students who were studying in China at the time, for example. So it was really interesting seeing how we had a very global perspective on quite a specific issue happening right in our doorstep. So these were some of the amazing campaigns. And actually, after that, we had an opportunity to hold a round table and speak to the students directly. And it was really enlightening because we actually found that a lot of students have been impacted by knife crime. Internationally, certainly wasn't unique to London. Some of the students have grown up in Waltham Forest and they've been able to bring their own lived experience into this project. And I think that had a real benefit on their experience as well as the students and young people we were trying to address. So fast forward from 2020 to now and to this very exciting moment as this launches tonight. And really this is Francesca's operation and some brilliant information on the website. But in collaboration with the Centre for Sustainable Fashion and Catalyst in Communities, REGO has now expanded well beyond that pilot remit to work with the 4 neighbouring boroughs, Waltham Forest, Newham, Tower Hamlets and Hackney are 4 neighbouring boroughs for the new campus, that is. And the idea that has expanded to work with local fashion brands and providing way more opportunities for young people to build new capabilities, gain employment and skills in that area. So we took from CUT all the key learnings and it's developed into essentially a framework that can be used moving forward for other diverse opportunities. And it'd be great to show the film, please. Thank you.
REGO means rethink your ego, go again and again on a continuous process of change in yourself and in society. It is a strategic design project that connects creative across different disciplines and uses the power of fashion, co-creation and storytelling to shift the prevailing narrative around youth violence. Through that, we are turning metal from knives through water jet and laser engraving into fashion items in collaboration with local fashion brands.
So with Project REGO, we have 2 parallel processes happening. We've got the creative process where people are learning the fashion skills. We've also got our mindset coaching process running alongside it. They work hand in hand because if you can develop the right mindset, You find it much easier to pick up new skills. You find it much easier to stretch beyond your present level of knowledge into new levels of knowledge.
So the workshops were delivered by some of our partnering brands, and they were really engaging sessions where the young people could learn new skills, but also understand new topics. So it's all about fashion activism, it's about engagement, it's about education, but it's also about learning how to speak your voice and how to communicate that through fashion.
I think it's important because we all have our own way of kind of expressing ourselves through fashion, and so I think having access to an industry that does that professionally, we can all be inspired by something and then express our personalities through that.
Some of the young people, alongside the training, they also are undertaking work experiences with fashion brands.
Thank you. To really enhance the opportunity here to work with students as well, and for students to have the opportunity to understand what's actually going on in local communities. This was then taken to the next level, to the MA Collaborative Challenge, which brought together students across the whole of London College of Fashion in this really dynamic collaborative unit, where they were briefed with how can we use fashion activism to create new designs, social enterprise models, and narratives against knife crime and youth violence. So rather than just going off and responding to creating campaigns, design and research, they were actually put into groups with the young people from the neighbouring boroughs, facilitated by consultants and by outreach champions as well, to create some real responses to this, to develop Rego into a really bona fide brand as we'll see it today. So that was an incredible opportunity for, again, in-depth co-creation. And this was supported by masterclasses looking into specifically how to activate change within resilient communities and really unraveling the meaning of fashion. So ultimately, the outcome for all the parties involved has been tremendous, because as you can see here, we've had the final campaign was shot by students from the School of Media and Communication, so hair and makeup, photography, stylists. These are the young people that were involved in the actual process of creation that have come from the neighbouring boroughs in East London, and they're going to be featured on billboards all across those boroughs as of the 23rd of May, which is exciting. Obviously, they'll all be at the launch tonight with live performances, spoken word, music, and the clothes themselves and the accessories and the jewellery will all be able to, everyone, the public will be able to loan them and rent them through rental platform Loanhood. So it's got a fantastic ongoing narrative as well. So just to sort of reflect, this project in its many iterations, it's really presented the positive impact that adopting quite radical and disruptive pedagogy can have upon both the student, but also the community, or, you know, this could be developed for future clients and communities. And I think for all the numerous accomplishments it's had over the past 2 years, probably the most important to highlight is the opportunity to foster closer connections with the local communities in which we engage. And to do that, we can start to tackle some systemic change, because there's a much better understanding, awareness and collaboration, not just between ourselves as academics, but between the students, which I think is really important to be able to bring your own lived experience forward. And so just so you're aware, in terms of what's happening next, all the proceeds raised will go towards supporting ongoing education and employment opportunities for young people in fashion. Just to reiterate, this is a framework. It's been developed. It had enormous amount of investment from numerous stakeholders and people involved. So we'd love to see what this could develop in the future. Once we've finished working with the local communities here, this could obviously be transformative for other communities worldwide. Thank you. And yes, please go and have a look at the website for all the incredible work that Francesca's been doing.
Thank you,
Very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
The introduction to this really impactful work. And please send our greetings from this event to Francesco.
We will do. Thank you.
So this brings us to our next project. I'm very happy and pleased to introduce Lisiba Mabitsela. Lisiba is an interdisciplinary artist, designer and fashion practitioner, currently based in Johannesburg and also he's joining us from Johannesburg right now. Lisiba's practice incorporates visual art, and design with critical fashion and performance studies. He's also a founding member of the African Fashion Research Institute. Lisiba will introduce one of his latest works and illustrate the value of artistic intervention for transformative learning. So we're curious to hear about the project, Lisiba.
Hello, thank you very much to the both of you, all the three of you, for inviting me. Firstly, maybe just to knock things off, I thought to maybe just state that I'm approaching this as not an academic, but more of an intellectual. My process has always been just to kind of collect a lot of disparate sort of knowledges around and bring them together in some sort of way, speak to, you know, that kind of influences the kind of work that I do. So yeah, I'm very honored to be here to speak to as many learned individuals in this room that I can. And I think maybe just to start off with, I want to dedicate this presentation to Ben Moyo, who recently left us. He was the director for the fashion film of the Cutting Room Project, but also an integral member of our creative team. The Cutting Room Project initially was conceptualized as a site-specific performance, and it was a continuation from a previous work that I did do called Re-Institute, that was developed as part of my MA in Theatre and Performance at the University of Cape Town. Basically, I was looking at the significance of the suit within the South African context, and how the suit inhibited or certainly sparked or symbolized an idea of masculinity that obviously came with the advent of colonialism. But not only a symbol, it also sparked this idea of a performance of masculinity. And these performances had been replicated in institutions. These institutions are ones that we see today as white, heteropatriarchal, and racist institutions that are still evident in much of South Africa since it was colonized by Britain. And then obviously there was also a lot of Dutch influence. And then the apartheid government came through and installed its own governmental regimes. So that's how it kind of started with the Cutting Room. But then what happened is that we had some sort of restrictions to how we were able to present the work. But maybe a little bit of a backstory as well, moving on to the next slide, in that the Cutting Room Project was something that I thought about when I was an intern at Gavin Raja, who is a South African fashion designer. What was interesting was my relationship with the staff, the people that worked within the studio, and not so much about, you know, the celebrities that we got to see every day. I really got into the stories that used to tell us about, you know, how it used to be back in the day, because Cape Town had a once thriving sort of garment trade. And so I thought one day I would do some sort of a documentary to kind of speak to the experiences of the staff that kind of worked within the space that was trending quite a lot, or that was kind of thriving at one point. Within this, I found it really interesting that Ilse Wolff, who wrote this book titled Unstitching Makes True Form, spoke to a building that I came to know through the jacket or the tailoring that my father used to wear. One of his jackets was made at Rex Trueform. And a little bit of a backstory about Rex Trueform. It was one of the plants that employed quite a number of people of color from the Cape Town area, predominantly women of color, colored and Black, worked in this factory, and they would create the suits for politicians, one of being rich men and politicians. And these politicians obviously later on would go on to instill these racist policies and instill laws to kind of separate people in terms of where they lived and communities based on their color. There was also instilled a sense of, there was also laws that removed people from spaces where they lived. So this was the introduction of the Groups Areas Act. But I was taken through this process of understanding how my previous research in understanding not only the symbolism of the suit, but also how the construction of the suit oppresses Black and brown men, and how similar, or how, you know, there's an overlap in terms of how Ilse Wolff critiqued the building of Rex Trueform, which was probably one of the first buildings that started to segregate workers within their factory based on their skin color. And it was quite interesting because the architect, Max Polanski, would go on and work for the Cape Town government. And it is said to believe that he was one of the pre-proponents before the legislation of the Separate or Groups Areas Act, in terms of creating the floor plan, or the living system, or the system that, you know, Cape Town would come to be known as today's. In terms of its spatial planning, what you have in Cape Town is the city center is more of a space that is seen to be inhabited by white South Africans or white foreigners. And they would come and buy up spaces within the city, whilst people of color live on the outskirts, very far away from the center of the city. So within Unstitching Rex Trueform, Ilse Wolff gave, you know, just to confirm my story for Max, but I kind of highlight where the important areas were. But in that, what emerged within the discussion with Manu is that Manu is one of the descendants of Mr. Max Polanski, is that at the time, Polanski produced the core projects of his practice, a period spanning from 1935 to 1960. The production of the modern architecture in Cape Town was intrinsically linked to industry, economy, and the capitalism, the nature of the resulting buildings being less high art objects, as is the case with the European counterparts. Moreover, the modern industrialization in Cape Town, together with state endorsement, spawned buildings that would ultimately become functionalist testimonies to the manner in which white industry and Black labor shaped the social fabric of the city. It was quite interesting actually in the research that whilst there was actually a downward current or a downward trend within the production industries in Cape Town, Rex Trueform managed to stay functioning until even today, which it's now rebranded or has been bought by another company. Why that may be the case is that, you know, the apartheid government saw this building as an example of what future they were planning to build before they instilled the apartheid bylaws in terms of spatial planning. The next slide kind of basically, or the video, basically talks to it's an introduction to the project that the project basically I did for the Institute for Creative Arts as a fellow in 2020, but also speaks to the connection between the suit and the building.
So when I look at it from a theoretical perspective, the suit as a symbol that oppressed Black male bodies, yet the building of Rex Trueform was a symbol that oppressed Black and brown women or female bodies. And that kind of had a really interesting sort of resonance for this project to happen. The construction of both the suit and Rex Trueform, the building, and tries to put those together or put them in conversation with each other.
So you'll have to apologize. There seems to be a problem with the formatting. But basically, I was just looking at what are the educational strengths of the project, because, you know, this was initially a performance a site-specific performance, but it ended up becoming a performance intervention. But what does that do within the context of art? How can art kind of help to kind of not necessarily cover the cracks, but essentially do the work that has been missing for such a long time? And other than the sort of goals that I've kind of bullet pointed there, placing women of color at the center of discussions, in terms of also making sure that you're able to create an archive, an online archive that is able to be shared much more freely and gives a lot more individuals, specifically from the African continent, a lot more access through the means of technology. I think this is one project which I really enjoyed, as it involved the testimonies of the staff that worked at Rex Trueform, a point of view that's not necessarily shared in the world of fashion, other than, you know, silver screens or some form of advert kind of looking at the heritage of a particular brand. And also looking at how this managed to connect clothing to the site of its making. That was very important, including the politics that govern that site. And therefore, and that the politics being colonialism and apartheid. So somehow these clothes have been given a sense of spirit, memory. There's also a sense of hauntology within the creation of the work. Clothes live, I guess, far beyond the inhabitants or the original purchaser of the garment. Sometimes I walk past garments on the street and I wonder where they come from. And, you know, in many ways, this kind of created that sense of resonance. I think also as the African Fashion Research Institute, what was important for us, or rather, what was the important building blocks, kind of showed itself within this work, in that we are trying to build or do the work that, you know, highlights African designers that are not necessarily part of the curricula, or designers who are showcased overseas, but, you know, due to issues like visa applications and differences within currencies, we don't necessarily have the privilege to be able to travel to go see the achievements of our held up high designers. So I think that was really important as for AFRI. It was one of our early sort of points of where we wanted to kind of create change in terms of what we think fashion education can look like. But I think what is really interesting is knowing that this project not only involved the testimonies of the young, but also involved the testimony, of the old, but it also involved the testimonies of the young. But it also showed how the garment manufacturing trade in Cape Town entered their homes. It grew as generational trade. Why that's so important? Because it's, you know, we still to this day, we have, you know, families that know how to, or that have centered their lives around the textile industry, or that have had the textile industry play such an important role in their upbringing. And you have often find 3 generations of women working in the factory. But also what was interesting in that, relating the idea of the suit, which I kind of saw as ideologically developed around this idea of European greatness. When you look at, you know, the story of Rex Trueform and the fact that kids were, or people at home were fitted with the suits, it kind of gives a different narrative. This idea that what is standard in South Africa as the standard size 36, for example, could have been modeled on a person of color back home. What was kind of the suit that was fitted on one of the politicians to pass the bylaws may have been fitted by a person of color back home. So I found that really interesting. And the video that's linked to this slide kind of puts that really across very strongly. Basically, this was just a video that kind of pushed, or that kind of told Lee's story in terms of how his father was linked to, who had sisters who worked in Rex True Form, and also how her aunt became also an outsource, or was outsourced later by the company that bought Rex True Form, but also intrinsically how, you know, that kind of developed his nature as someone that was within the garment trade industry as well. We centered the suit, obviously, and I thought of using this idea of the storyboard as an example of, or rather in a creative, more creative sort of way. I know in the fashion industry, we have storyboards, but we never really show where our insights, our inspirations come from. It's always just the final collection. And so with this work, what we tried to do was to bring the storyboard to life, actually. And us shifting from a live performance into a digital space helped us to kind of get the work, or rather helped us to do that in a very visual way. So what we ended up doing was we had the floor plan of Rex True Form. We had the original Rex True Form suit that was given to us, which the pattern is on your right-hand side there. And we also had the map of Cape Town interacting with each other. Storyboards were kind of, or rather information was shared in the forms of photographs, Polaroid photographs, that would disappear once you finish the hearing the testimonies of the participants. And then obviously the way, the aesthetic that it kind of looked, it was more of a stitch sort of aesthetic to kind of work with this idea of tailoring as well. The garments themselves, we created from secondhand garments, which I one day decided, you know what, we need to create a fashion form for this work. And so I sourced Rex True Form, former Rex True Form garments from people online. So I would go on Facebook and ask, I would look for Rex True Form garments. Some Rex True Form garments were donated to me as well, which we started to, you know, we used Ilse Wolf's studio as the site of this, you know, deconstruction of the suits to create other things. The next slide, we kind of show you the ideas that we were kind of looking at. Also the idea that I was looking at was also I was kind of melding into a new idea with the white vests, the wife beaters, because also a part of this research within suits and this idea of masculinities was one that was deeply violent, which I wanted to kind of explore a little bit further. And I think maybe this is really important in that this is largely a team effect. This is work that could not have come together without collaboration. And maybe when we're talking about education for the future, we really need to be invested in this idea of interdisciplinary exchange and transdisciplinary exchange, but also engaging with people's stories from where they come from. It was easy for me because I had been someone who, I had my leg into Rex True Form based on my dad's jacket, but it opened up such you know, possibilities and stories of people that were actually from Cape Town. And within that exchange, I also learned to not center myself within this expression. I really loved being able to step back at moments and let other people tell their stories. Yeah, and I think, yeah, in terms of, you know, education, that's probably where the best sort of work comes from you know, working with people from outside of, you know, what you are usually used to, you know, in digital, in terms of, you know, photography, in terms of 3D graphics and so forth. Yeah, I think that's really a really interesting sort of viewpoint to go through. And yeah, I think that's basically it. The last slide was meant to kind of just highlight the people who were part of this project. It was quite a large team, and before you know it, I was wondering how the hell did I end up with, so many people working under one project. But I think that's what the art world does. It becomes this glue that brings these industries together, these people together, for a single sort of goal, which essentially ends up being very educational, or a rather good example of how we can create fashion education through other sort of means.
Thank you very much, Lesiba, and a great point to end on, and a great point also to pass over to Laya Chiravuru, who is a fashion designer and researcher from India, currently based in Germany, and she's the community engagement and design research lead of Root Studio. She's a design research graduate from the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, and her master's thesis investigated the contemporary notions of sustainability in craft-based India fashion that are being shaped by internalized colonial perspectives. And she says that there's a lot of unlearning to do in the work that she's doing. Over to you, and a warm welcome, Laya.
Thank you, Renate, for the introduction. Yeah, so I have been associated with Root Studio since a few months, and it has been an exciting journey for me. And before I begin talking about Root Studio, I think it's very important to share the journey of the founder and CEO, Rebecca Hoy. And it's particularly relevant because we are discussing transforming education today. Yeah, Rebecca started her journey about a decade ago when she visited India with an urban planning and architecture background. She was initially mapping the shifting cultures in the rural urban transition. And in a few years of having experienced India, she observed that a big reason for poverty in the rural areas is the lack of access to education in the interior parts of the villages. She then came up with this idea of building a school on wheels. And her plan was that if a mobile school existed where local teachers could go to the interior parts of the village and teach underprivileged kids, then it can solve the problem of lack of education. But soon the teachers told her that the kids were not showing as much interest, and they were a little shy when it came to learning subjects like mathematics and English. But Rebecca observed that the kids were surprisingly very energetic and bold when it came to creative forms like dance, music, and art. She could see that the whole perspective with which she was viewing education had been very one-dimensional. Art was mainly rooted in the cultural values of children in these communities, and it was being obscured by dominant systems of education that demanded the kids to set aside their cultural artistic identity and catch up with the Western perception of progress. So after this self-reflection, Root Studio was born with the initiative to amplify the existing cultural knowledge and skills in these communities and encourage the artists to continue practicing their art, prevent loss of heritage, and establish an equitable mode of generating income for these communities. So Root Studio is a for-profit social enterprise that connects indigenous artists to the global fashion industry through an alternative model of cultural preservation by consensually digitizing and licensing their art. So far, we have worked with over 3,000 artists from marginalized communities in India, China, Syria, Panama, and Indonesia. The way we do this is by conducting community workshops every year, scanning the work of the artists with their consent, documenting their cultural narratives behind the art, engaging with them collectively in a constant dialogue to understand their values, traditions, and rituals, and maintaining transparency by reporting to them the work done and the milestones we have achieved each year. And then on the other end of this system is the fashion industry, continuously looking for inspiration from unexplored and underexplored art forms. Root Studio plays a role of a bridge between the indigenous communities and the global fashion markets by digitizing and contextualizing heritage art on contemporary fashion and lifestyle products. So straddling both these ends is where the challenge lies in, because fashion as a system is reputed for cultural appropriation. So one way we are able to tackle this problem is by reimagining cultural preservation through digitization and by bringing more focus and visibility to the artists who often go neglected and silenced. So our philosophy rests upon these three pillars. First is respect for the meanings and cultural values that the art and base of life are rooted in, and understanding how this translates into the work and respecting authorship. The second is reciprocity in this process by constant dialogue and years of hard and consistency to build a trust relationship with the communities, and by ensuring that it's not merely a transactional approach, but one where their stories are told and their voices are amplified with every brand collaboration. And then remuneration, of course, for their meticulous work and through a system of regular profit returns and maintaining a practical view of art appreciation by channeling it into viable products that can projects that can support these communities. And we believe that all these three aspects must go hand in hand. And we keep seeking regular consent and feedback from the artists whenever brand collaborations take place. We've been made aware that certain motifs and patterns, which are very sacred to a particular community, cannot be applied onto products like footwear or in placements like the crotch area. This learning could only be possible through consistent communication. And even during our scheduled profit returns, it's been important to understand how each community prefers the profit splits, if they're individualistic or have collective interests. So through these community meetings, we were able to plan a community fund apart from the individual profit returns. We pay close attention to the narratives that are shared through the marketing campaigns of our partner brands and ensure that they do not come across as pitiful or glamorizing or romanticizing the notions of rural lifestyles. We conduct interviews with the artists and encourage them to share their stories and how they would like to identify themselves and their community through the art. Our goal is to help the existing fashion system redefine value by drawing fashion closer to cultural heritage. And it took years of engaging with communities to reach to the sensitized understanding of education, progress, and development, what these ideals mean, while working with cultures that embrace an entirely different wisdom about these ideals, where knowledge and expertise exist in the form of art and craft heritage. So personally, during my master's research, I was looking into the cruciality of cultural sustainability, what this ideology of cultural sustainability means. During India's colonial history, many sustainable systems of crafts collapsed because aesthetics were separated from the cultures that held them together, and crafts were commercialized for their material and aesthetic value, whereas the cultural resources that supported them were completely sidelined. So the aspect of cultural sustainability is what resonates with me at Root Studio. It's always an ongoing dialogue when we work with indigenous artists. Even if certain processes have worked before, we have to continuously readapt our ways to suit community specific interests. So it's always an exercise of devising systems that are flexible. And we are in this constant process of unlearning and relearning to break away from dominant ways of measuring value. And it's a thoroughly enriching process for us. Thank you. And I think Rebecca is also in the audience if she wants to add a few words, maybe.
Thank you, Laya. And welcome, Rebecca, if you may want to add some to Laya's presentation.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if I can step in here. Am I live or am I like behind the scenes right now?
You're live.
Oh, I'm live. Okay. Well, great to meet everyone. Laya explained it way better than I could. I'll turn on my video. Yeah, it's such a refreshing conversation that we can have around how often we actually really don't know. And I think Laya mentioned it perfectly. It's a constant process of learning and unlearning. And this whole step of the way, it's always, we come with a certain idea or approach and execution, but we're always continuously challenged. There's no way or no one methodology. And I think that it's so great that we can have this conversation, especially in the context of fashion, which moves very quickly and often has a certain, idea. But yeah, Laya covered everything, so I don't have that much more to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and yeah, thank you very much, Laya, and really all three of the speakers for these very inspiring project presentations and for illustrating how fashion can be learned in different settings and learned very differently. And I think the key word here is really this process of mutual learning and unlearning. We would now like to open the long table discussion, which leads into an open Q&A. And yeah, I put a couple of times, please post your questions in the chat and they can be taken up, and you can join the conversation then. So for the long table, you see the speakers, most of which are part of the Einstein Circle Fashioning Education, and we're really thrilled to have two fashion design students also with us joining the conversation today. There's Timisola Shazania joining us from London. She's a menswear fashion design student at Centre St. Martin's. And there's also Melchior Rasch, yeah, make yourself known a little bit, who is a fashion design student at the Berlin University of the Arts. And then joining the long table also is Oliver Eber, director of the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Berlin, and Dilys Williams joining us from London, who's the founder and director of Centre for Sustainable Fashion at London College of Fashion. And Tanvir Ahmed, who's also joining us from London today, who's senior lecturer in fashion and race at Central St. Martin's. Thank you all for joining us, and I pass over to Oliver for a quick sort of a few provocative words in a way to get this long table started.
Good evening all together, and of course you're raising quite a few expectations because I'm now everybody is expecting something provocative, and I'm not sure how much I can come up with the expectations. So I'm a trained economic geographer and also a sociologist, and I'm commenting on this debate a little bit from the sideline. So I'm not in fashion education, but I did some sociological research on creativity processes and also process of value creation. And thank you very much to the three presenters. The projects are really fascinating and really inspiring. And two of them were even quite geographical. So I really enjoyed these, your idea of connecting the suit, the item, and the factory building. For instance, this is something very geographical, and also the ideas about the rural communities and the lack of access they have is also a question that matters very strongly in my own discipline. So thank you very much for this. We had a similar session to this one a couple of months ago. We also heard about three alternative fashion education projects, and my feeling was a bit first of all, I was really fascinated, and I was really positively impressed by the projects and by the ideas and by the initiative of the initiators. But then I also had a little bit mixed feelings, and I sat down and put down on paper what these feelings were about. And the title of this little essay was "Beating Fashion with Its Own Weapon." So my feeling was that these projects, in a sense, were critical with the predominant practices of the fashion industry nowadays, and at the same time, these projects were themselves very fashionable. So I asked myself, how far is it possible to beat fashion with its own weapons? And this might also be the case with the 3 projects we heard about today. And just to give you a few ideas about, let's say, sociological knowledge about the fashion industry. So the fashion industry is described as a status market, right? So status markets are markets, for instance, that rest on uncertain evaluation criteria. So it is very much about look and feel, aesthetics, the right vibe, the freshness of color. So very subjective measures to assess value in comparison to standard markets, where the performance can be measured quite straightforwardly by applying standardized and objective measures. And this is not possible on status markets, and it's definitely not possible in fashion. And so people depend on evaluation by external authorities, and they have no or little control about the evaluation criteria that are applied. These markets are positional, so the performance is not valued in themselves, but in comparison to the performance of others. And it's necessary to stand out of the crowd. So you have an overcrowded market, and only very few people are able to climb up the highest position and become visible. And this also translates in winner-takes-all markets, where you have a few star fashion designers that make a whole lot of money, but also a large army of precarious workers. Then, of course, these markets are relational, so it's not only up to yourself and your own creativity, but you also need associations to others, strong counterparts, partners. Unless you don't have them, it becomes very difficult. And status markets are attentional, so it's very much about catching attention by others, by third parties, and attention is a scarce resource and also a transient resource, so it's very difficult to perform in the long run on attentional markets. And then you have, of course, institutionalized power, so brands are institutions that are charged with value, and unless you cannot constitute a brand, it becomes very difficult to make a value claims. And my feeling was that all the projects we heard about, in a sense, criticized the fashion system at one point, but endorsed the same system at different other points. And this was my uneasiness, my uneasy feeling. But thinking a little bit further, I asked myself, who else, rather than, I would say, reputable fashion designers, could challenge the system? So I think the challenge has to come from within the system. It cannot be carried into the system from outside. What we heard today in the presentations, I think, is something I would call institutional creativity, right? So it's not so much the fashion item itself that is creative here, but rather the institutional environment in which the fashion is created. has been changed at decisive positions. And I think this is maybe the questions that we should ask to those questions. So one thing is, what exactly is criticized about the of the fashion system, and what is attacked, so to say, and what is endorsed, and the second question is a group of how questions. So how is it achieved? How do you, for instance, how do you challenge fashion at this point, and what established parts of sessions can be also carried with them?
Thank you, Oliver, for this first thoughts, and I think it was a very interesting reaction of Oliver to our first public event last year, and we thought it was worth it to take it up into conversation. And I would welcome now Dilys Williams, because we had in our internal circle meetings, we already started a conversation on this topic, and yeah, I would hand over to you. Welcome, Dilys.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And firstly, a huge thank you to yourself, Renata, for organising today, and for the amazing speakers, because actually it means that we can start this conversation from a different place than we usually start conversations about fashion education. And yes, thank you, Oliver, for this great provocation. And there's so much in it that resonates with me. I think we all wrestle with our own roles, with what we are supporting and what we're kind of endorsing, and you know, to take Albert Camus' idea of rebellion, what do you actually need to amplify, and what actually do you need to negate? And we have to sit within that tension of that. You know, that is what rebellion is. A rebellion is simultaneously really amplifying great work, the things that we really feel can create change, and at the same time actively negating the stuff that we can no longer sit by and let continue to happen. And I think that's something that in fashion education we have to be really mindful of. And as you say, sometimes you're having both things actually within one project or within one idea. But in my direct response, and I want to keep it short as well, because I know there's lots of speakers, is that fashion education, certainly in the Western world, is very focused on the fashion sector and feeding and serving the fashion industry. And I think the fundamental question that we maybe need to ask in response to your provocation is, you know, what does fashion education serve? So what do any of these projects serve? And that can help us to really identify the elements of it that we do want to amplify, and the elements of it that actually are holding up the status quo. You know, the idea of transformation and the three horizons theory around transformation talks about the notion of the status quo, and then creating new ideas, and those new ideas, as they grow and develop, either go off to be a transformed way of living and being, or they get commodified and they become a way to hold up the status quo. And we see that in and beyond fashion. So just to maybe sort of finish off this question around what does fashion education serve, I think that what we've seen today is that it should serve a range of livelihoods for a range of people around the world doing all sorts of different things. And it needs to be something that helps the skills of all of those different kinds of roles. It needs to be an incredible, curious journey around imagination of lots of different disciplines. Fashion is a discipline, but it's also lots of different disciplines, and thinking about how those disciplines can imagine a different world and imagine a different way to serve people within a more than human world. I think that fashion is, as again, these three examples of actually what it serves in society, and how it serves societies and cultures. And I could talk actually quite a bit about this idea of cultural sustainability that wasn't even recognized in documentation until quite recently. There's nothing in the SDGs, for example, around cultural sustainability. So what can fashion education actually serve in terms of cultures in societies? And then the fourth element is the sector. Yeah, and as the last presentation showed very clearly, you know, the 3 R's: respect, I can't say the middle ones. I have a bit of a lisp. And remuneration. And yes, we've got to be imagine and be pragmatists as well. So I haven't probably sort of finished that off very well, but I'm very aware of time and there's lots of great speakers. So I hope this begins to have the first response to your provocation, Oliver. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dilys. And I want to pass over to Timisola and Melchior, who are, you know, with their choice to study fashion design, really sort of have voted with your feet and your hands, as it were, to see, you know, fashion as a transformative tool. And I'd love to hear your perspectives. Maybe Timisola, we start with you.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's talked today. It's really been interesting to hear different people's perspective on fashion and their idea of fashion education and where it can go. I think for me as a fashion student, within my work, I always go through my culture and try and see how I can bring that, especially studying in Central St. Martin's, which is like a university based in London, in like Western fashion, and what I'm learning within class and ways that I can kind of bring my culture and what I learn within my work to show people that there's so much that you can say within fashion. And I think I remember like hearing that fashion is such a huge tool, because in the Western society, within fashion, it's mostly with what's embedded within the industry, whereas fashion is so much more than that. And I think within my practice, and I feel like going forward, it would be really interesting to see how we can show different cultures and other people's perspective of life and what they've seen, and how they can bring that to fashion. Because again, fashion is so much more than just the clothes. It's the story, it's the photography, the films, anything that you really want to say. So I think that's from like what I've heard as well, even thinking back to what Lasiba said about sometimes it's just taking a step back and letting other people educate you and almost like tell you their own perspective. So it's more of what you can gain as well. Yeah.
Tanvir, I'd like to also bring you into the conversation. Tanvir, you're also part of the Einstein Circle, and we've had a little bit of this conversation as a starter, and you made really important points. We thought about community-based fashion learning and gave some great examples. So just over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Just wanted to say thanks again to you and Francesca for organising this. I think it's brilliant to have this space to really talk about what fashion education should be, and just echo what everyone else has said. So I think it's great to have these spaces. Renata, did you want me to I was just going to mention a collective, the Muslim Sisterhood. Shall I talk about that now?
Francisca's going to just show the example.
A couple of images, fab, yeah. So when I was chatting to Fashion Education Circle and things I've been thinking of in terms of identity and culture and what fashion could be, one of the collectives that I'm quite interested in at the moment are a UK London-based group called the Muslim Sisterhood. They've been kind of working for a couple of years now, since late 2017. You may have seen them. They've already been featured in Vogue, for example, and they talk very much about how they wanted to assert their Muslim identity, and they forged themselves as a collective. And why they really appealed to me is my background is Muslim, growing up in London, and how I was brought up around fashion was in a very binary way. So I was very much the kind of Muslim identity part of me was, I'd say, invisibilized from outside of the home. So literally I would come back home from school and I would change into different sets of clothes that were for want of a better word, modest, and it kind of kept that bit very separate. And what I'm really excited about the Muslim Sisterhood is they seem to really disrupt that binary that my generation possibly was brought up in. And I think it's interesting as we're getting more kind of third, fourth generation communities, diaspora communities, how they're rethinking a lot of these binaries that are embedded within fashion, that are part of the modernity project. And so they, to me, really seem to represent a new vocabulary around fashion that redefines what fashion is. And I think this kind of lies at the heart of the project to decolonize fashion, to really rethink what are the words, what are the tools. And I was really interested what you were saying, Oliver, about how do we criticize fashion if we are endorsing it, with the very same kind of ways that that we're criticizing. But I think the groups like the Muslim Sisterhood, they are presenting an alternative space. But I wanted to pick these couple of pictures because I think what's interesting is as they have become more established, when they're in kind of publications like Vogue, like Marie Claire, I think it'd be interesting for us as a collective, for us to think about, what happens next. So we know this about the way that fashion kind of appropriates, steals, takes things up, and how do groups like this, in this really sped up capitalist cycle of fashion, how can they maintain and sustain themselves? I think this is the sort of questions we should be thinking about, because I think there are many, many more platforms and groups like this who are really exploring culture and identity in exciting ways and rethinking, these definitions of fashion. But where do they go, and what happens when the kind of the dominant model of fashion comes into direct conversation with them? So those are the sorts of things I thought were kind of interesting about a group such as this and how they're thinking about diaspora fashion. So it'd be interesting to hear what others think.
Thank you very much, Tanvia. I think connected to this point was also your point to really talk about the economy in different ways, or in more frank ways. And there's a comment in the chat by Hilda Heim, who said, it's about various fashion systems, and by Jenna Sigal, who said it's important to recognize that fashion exists within this larger system. So, how's it possible, whilst existing in this larger system, to generate change?
We had discussed it previously in the meeting that it sounded very familiar, but I guess I'm going to read this time because this is sort of the document that I kind of brought. I don't know if you can see it. It's got that blurred stuff. But anyway, I was just thinking about how familiar it sounded to Audre Lorde's critique of white feminism. So the idea that master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it's also just understanding what we're talking about when we're discussing tools. So the idea of ideology, the idea of belief systems. And, in my thinking, it was about, as the Einstein circle, where do we see ourselves in the circle? Do we see ourselves as the centerpiece, or do we see ourselves as the margins? Because that's a very important sort of understanding in terms of how we decide to dismantle fashion. Are we dismantling fashion from this idea that we're looking for this sameness that initially kind of, resulted in where fashion is today, which is with a largely Western focused idea of, how fashion started, how it got to this point, how it's, found its position within the world. Or, are we looking at accepting our differences? And, in accepting our differences is accepting that the fact that, our struggle where social justice within fashion is concerned within South Africa is not the same as for instance, the struggles within the Northwest. It's not the same as well in terms of Black societies within, the global South and the global North. Our politics are different from the African continent compared to, the politics of diaspora. And so I was just thinking about, this idea of us as a circle. Are we necessarily finding we're not necessarily finding what's the same, but rather accepting that we are different. And that comes knowledge systems, but also, our influences, so our backgrounds. If I'm pretty lucky that I got to do theater and performance, and that kind of gave me a different viewpoint in terms of how fashion could be critiqued or looked at. The fact that you can look at one range for like 3 or 4 years is something that is not necessarily a practice within fashion, but I think, once we start to look at collections like artworks, it allows us to kind of have more critique. And, once you sit with the knowledge of an artwork, different arguments come up, and contexts are also kind of change based on where these collections are allowed to be shown, the conversations that they're allowed to be part of. And so in the context of our activism to transform fashion education, we need to, I was thinking, accept the social activist aims, goals, and experiences in the West are not, as I've mentioned, not the same. And then can we incorporate difference, experience, politics? And yeah, this is what I was trying to get at is, what is occupying the edge? Yes, as a collective group, but not necessarily have collective sort of goals in mind. Is it a possibility? What does a ring look like as opposed to not, and I guess it kind of talks to this idea of decentralizing the fashion system, but I'm really interested in that area. Like, what does that look like? Is it finding commonalities or is it not finding commonalities? But it's also, I think what she also mentioned in her essay is that it's not necessarily for Black people or Black designers to speak, the story or educate individuals from the West about fashion from Africa. It would be really interesting if people from the West did as much or took as much initiative in finding out about fashions from the African continent, the struggles from the African continent as well.
Hi, evening everybody. So lovely to be here. Such interesting conversations. I definitely agree with Lisiba. It's oftentimes the work and who has to do the work, and nobody really is willing to do work, but work has to be done. And so I think it's really interesting how we move forward within the interdisciplinary realities and relationship with fashion, with art, finding almost like a fine line or through line, really, the balance of it all. I think within the art multidisciplinary understanding, there needs to be a space of intersectionality. And oftentimes that can sometimes look more of a traffic jam than flowing traffic. And I think it's going to be really interesting how in the near future we turn oftentimes that intersectionality can look like a traffic jam into more flowing traffic. How do we keep multiple ideas, perspectives, just like many cars, whether it be your Honda, your Mercedes, your BMs, and those also come with different types of drivers. There are multiple driving forces that are pushing particular ideologies within such spaces. So how do we allow for new voices? How do we actually stop and go, actually, this is not going to work. Actually, it's not my work for me to do your work. And it's going to be really interesting to hear those voices who will be as bold as Lisiba to say, actually, it's not my problem that you have no idea what needs to happen here. It's up to you. And I think that's really going to be interesting. I think even 65 of us have checked, most of us are white women over the age of probably 30, even within this group. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see post post meetings or post conversations like this, how we're really going to engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesiba. Thank you, Hannah, for your very interesting points. And I think that, so me, I'm studying fashion design in the Western world, so in the middle of the Western world in Berlin, in Germany. And I think it's very interesting that you say, Hannah, that it's that it's not your fault, and it's not you to deal with that. And I think that's a very important point. And Lesiba also mentioned in his talk that that it's kind of necessary to blame industries and blame the economic economic leaders of the fashion industry. And I think that's also a point we have to deal with. And me as a fashion design student, I get taught by different fashion designers, and I have projects and different companionships with different organizations and fashion labels. And I also think every time, what can I do? And don't want to be part of the economic views of fashion or the economic parts of fashion. And I think what Lesiba does with this project is a very good point, that fashion doesn't have to be always economic. Fashion can also be like activist, or fashion can also be like a political state of mind. And that was also why I asked in the chat if Lesiba is seeing his work of his project as art pieces or as products, fashion products, because I think that's an interesting thing, that fashion can also be an artwork or a political statement or something, or just a voice to say something. And I think that's very important for me as a student, that I don't have to be part of the economic things in fashion, but it's also possible to find new ways. And I think also that's a good thing of the fashion educationing circle, that you can find answers if you're a bit struggling or troubling with fashion, and also with fashion design. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to chime in as well, because obviously, same with me, I am a fashion student, and when it comes, like I spoke about before, when it comes to my work, I usually tap into my culture, and with things like that, ways I can bring that into the Western world, because again, I'm studying at Central St. Martin's, it's based in the UK, and it's how I can bring what I've learned in my culture, I'm Nigerian, into my work. And with me, I had to go out and find all this information about myself, because I predominantly grew up in England. So it's interesting how Lesiba was talking about like being like putting yourself out there, because at the end of the day, if you want to be interested and learn new topics and new cultures and new ways to change fashion, you also have to put in the initiative. And I think that's something that hopefully will change in the fashion educational system, because like now in university, we have talks on Mondays where it's mostly about culture and cultural studies, ideally. And even though it's only a couple hours of our day, it is something that is so insightful, and that I wish that they did more of, because it's really impactful for someone like me, who has pretty much grown up in England my whole life, compared to a lot of people who want to learn different cultures and different like topics, and how like fashion isn't just, again, about the clothes and what the fashion industry has to say, it's about what you want to take from it as well. So yeah, that's my point of view.
Thank you, Sola. Tanvir.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Timisola, and I think the and Lesiba, I think these are really such brilliant, important points to make. So thank you. I was just going to kind of come back to methodology, because I think so many of these things that we're talking about, how do we deal with cultural difference? How do we come to terms with difference? That's such a kind of root of how we rethink, redefine, rework, reimagine fashion. And I think the methodology kind of lies at the heart of this. And part of the reason that I think collectives are so important at the moment, how they democratize and in their kind of ways of working. And back to Oliver's point about how we, who's going to challenge the fashion industry, and how do we do it? Is it an insider? Is it outsiders? How does this happen? And I think that when we start to think about so many activist groups, grassroots groups, how they're kind of bottom up, horizontal organizing. And I think for me, many of the questions are, how do you have these kind of methods that are democratic, participatory, that are bottom up? How do you have them in an institution that's colonial, that has got violent histories, such as the art school and the university? And I think these are the real tensions that we have, because we're talking about how do we educate here, and we've got I'd argue the assessment processes are really violent. They're about categorizing people. We know, for example, in the UK, we have an attainment gap in universities between Black and brown students and their white counterparts. That's what the data shows us. So how do we think about methods that are going to address these, pedagogical methods that are about, about kind of bringing equality into the classroom, about addressing the inequalities that are in the classroom, and kind of having these conversations about cultural difference, about culture, about identity in these ways. So I think, the question of democratizing fashion education is key.
Thank you very much, Tanvir. What struck me in relation to what you just said, and Dilys's point about what is rebellion amplifying and negating, the question arises: we can amplify, but how much can we negate? How radically can we negate? In this house, can we tear down the house that we're in? Which can we cut off a hand that feeds us? So there's a question there, and I think that's also the same for the students. How radically can you question a system that you still need to validate you, to give you a future? And as let's say leading learners, we're in the same position within these institutions.
There was just one thing coming to my mind, because temporary at the moment we have like a little competition week at the moment. We are doing a project for a store in Berlin, and we are all doing like one thing. We have a task to do. At the end, it's like a little bubble around a week where we all have this competition, and where we really can feel like how fashion industry works, or how competitive fashion sometimes is. And I think it's was a very interesting experience for me, because I really realized how students to each other reacted completely differently than in other situations than outside of the week. And I think it's very important to for the university work, that you put really hard borders around such competitive projects, because you always have to keep in mind that this is only one thing that fashion can do, and you really have to say that, okay, students, listen to me, that's just 1 week where you learn how fashion works in economic ways, but there are also a lot of different ways you can do that. And I think most of my students the students I'm studying with at the university don't know that. They think fashion is really working only in that one direction. I think we always have to mention that there are different ways to do it, and different ways to be creative somehow.
Yeah, I was gonna add on exactly with what you were saying about how sometimes it is quite difficult, because it's like, again, like as a fashion student, what do I then do when I'm put in a situation where it's like, we still have to benefit from the fashion industry in order to progress forward as creatives, but we're struggling, I guess, in a sense, with trying to like be in an educational system that is Is it moving forward? Is it progressing? And I think for me, again, when it comes to my work, because I speak mostly about my identity and my culture, it can be quite demoralizing in a sense when I feel like my voice can't be heard, because there are certain situations where you feel like you're trying to express yourself in a way, but it almost feels like you're being pulled back because there's a certain part of that the educational system hasn't reached, like there's a level it hasn't reached yet in order for you to fully express what you're trying to say or like within your research. And I think again with like that point, it's almost like there's so much that you can do within fashion, and I really hope that that's something that we reach in this level, I guess, because I look at myself and I also look at my friends who are also studying the same things and what they struggle with in terms of speaking their mind, but also feeling like the industry is something that they have to like battle with. And it's quite interesting, that point you made about breaking it from within. And I think that's, yeah, like again, it's such an interesting thing to say, because it's almost like I feel like that is what we have to do. It's almost pushing what our ideas, pushing what we're excited about in order to say, oh, hey, I can change the industry. I can change it for the better, ideally. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Timisola, and we'll take these to be the closing words today, because we've come to the limits of our time, but it's not the end of a conversation. It's really the beginning of many conversations to be had, the continuation of conversations. And we first of all would like to hugely thank the different speakers, again, Stephanie, Lasiba and Laia, for introducing your work, introducing these projects that let us dream of different ways of learning together, but also the speakers at the long table. Thank you so much for joining us, and really everyone in the audience. And we would like to point you to three ways of continuing this conversation. One is in October, the 12th of October, we'll continue the digital multilog on fashion education, and this year's question is, what can fashion education do? And it's going to be a very interactive format this time to really develop solutions together. The next event that we would like to highlight, even if it's early days, but to take this conversation offline very much and really be able to meet in a space, the conference on fashioning education, 15th and 16th of September 2023 in Berlin, as a fast save the date. And then we would also like to draw your attention to another conversation that took place before this one with Tanvir, and is part of the podcast Fashion is a Great Teacher, that Franziska and I have been running for a year and a half to really record some of these conversations and continue them over a longer time. And Tanvir's episode just launched today, and she speaks on the freedom and violence of fashion education and love as a way to reform it. So you're very much invited to that. And really, yeah, a big thank you from Franziska and myself.
Thank you to everyone.